Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this session, Managing End of Life Systems Strategically, where we're going to talk about preparing for Windows 10 end of life and beyond. We have a lot of great insights for you today, but before we start, I have a few housekeeping items to cover. First, we'll aim to run about 60 minutes today. Second, this webinar is being recorded and you will get a copy of the recording and the slides after the event. And lastly, attendees are in listen only mode, but you can enter questions into the Q&A function as we go. The session is 60 minutes today, but we are saving a bunch of that time at the end to get to as many questions as possible. And we hope you do stick around to that end. We will be doing a raffle after the session for a $50 gift card. It'll be the winner's choice, $50 to Amazon or Starbucks. All you have to do to enter is stick around to the end and answer the short 3-question survey that will pop up automatically when you leave the call. We'll be selecting one winner and we will let you know if you have won by the end of the day. With that, I'd like to introduce you to today's speakers. First, we have Josh McNulty. He is a virtual Chief Information Security Officer at DataPrize, who has more than a decade of experience on the cybersecurity side. We also have with us Brendan Thompson, Director of Project Architecture and Delivery at DataPrize. Brendan has nearly 20 years of experience in developing IT operations and architecture. So thank you, Josh and Brendan, for joining us.
Yeah.
You have a you have a pair of experts here to talk both about the security and the operational technology side of this issue. So it's going to be a great conversation. And you also have me. My name is Stephanie Hamrick. I'm the Senior Marketing Manager at DataPrize, and I will be the moderator for our discussion today. Next, I'll tell you very quickly about DataPrize for those who don't know us, and then we will get right into it. So DataPrize is a national managed services provider. We have been providing services end to end for our clients across the United States since 1995. We believe technology should enable our customers to be the best at what they do. So we deliver best in class managed help desk, cybersecurity, network, infrastructure, collaboration, end user solutions, all of the things to help you get there. Now, let me share a little bit about what is in store. So, we have 3 sections for you today. We're going to start off talking about some considerations for end of life systems, what you need to know before you can strategically handle them. Then, we'll talk specifically about Windows 10, the end of life deadline that's at the top of everyone's mind here. And then we'll finish up with a discussion of the contingency plans you should be thinking about whenever you're running any end of life systems in your environment. So, with that, we'll move into our first section, which is what you don't want to hear about end of life systems, which actually is going to be a few things that you really need to hear about managing end of life systems. And the first thing you may not want to hear is that it's riskier than you think not to address these end of life systems. So, we have our little friendly ghost here, and we're going to see him throughout the presentation today as a reminder that risk, although not a physical object you can see, very much real, and it can be looming right around the corner. So, Josh, I'm going to hand this one over to you to talk about what those risks are.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. Now, when we're talking about these end of life, end of support systems, there are many, many, many risks that really all, materialize from a subset of a few hierarchical ones, and we're going to talk through those. And primarily, we're first going to talk about, systems compromise and breach. We've seen this time and time again, and ultimately, we will continue to see this. We saw it with Windows XP, Windows 7. We're going to see it with Windows 11. You're going to be forced to purchase extended support, or you're going to be forced to upgrade your system, or you're going to be forced to secure your existing end of life systems. Now, the likelihood of systems compromise or breach increases exponentially when you leave these end of life systems as end of life and end of support, and when you do not further secure them. Especially if they're not secured, they have boundless vulnerabilities that can be exploited and have been exploited previously. Now, this is because primarily it is easy for any actor of any depth, even if they're a low level threat actor, let alone a sophisticated one, At this point, you're just making life easy for the attacker. You're basically inviting them in. The least amount of work that they have to do is ultimately the most efficient path for compromise, and that's the one they're going to take. And piggybacking off of the systems compromise or breach is potential for brand reputation damage. Now, brand reputation damage is obviously another major risk that exists when these systems are present in the environment. It extends from the previous risk we just talked about around systems compromise and breach. So just imagine your organization has just suffered a major breach of customer or sensitive information, and your incident response uncovers that the root cause was actually that the attacker exploited the much weaker end of life or end of life systems in your environment just to get that initial foothold, and then they propagated throughout the environment from there. They collected and potentially modified or exfiltrated data in some type of unauthorized fashion. Now, because the sensitive information, PII, or other customer information was manipulated in some way, shape, or form and potentially exfiltrated by that bad actor, your organization now has to figure out whether you have to make a public statement, contact any individuals, consumers, or customers saying that their data was in your systems, and ultimately from your systems, it was exfiltrated by a potentially malicious party that may have intents to use their data for malicious purposes. Now, this breeds a lot of negative exposure, right? It's way more than enough to erode customer or consumer trust, and that's happened time and time again with companies, major and small businesses in the past. So ultimately, it is definitely worth upgrading your end of life systems compared to this potential alternate reality of having very low customer trust and potentially losing customers. And moving on from that, another major risk associated is around compliance. Many organizations are bound by some level of compliance, and this may differ based on your industry, your regulatory requirements, whether you process any data, and many more factors under that umbrella. The last thing any organization wants to have happen related to any compliance initiative is to fail an audit and potentially not be able to service certain customers due to a lapse in some type of contractual requirement or agreement, or something of this nature. And again, this also has some level of negative exposure associated. Your clients, your customers may find out that ultimately you were not able to obtain certification or had certification revocation or fine associated, and they may not want to do business with you, or due to contractual requirements, they may not be able to do business with you. Now, additionally, compliance violations also exist, and those violations come with fines, and very serious fines at that. The fines may be passed down through one of the supervisory bodies, depending on the regulation, and ultimately, these fines can come in various amounts, and they can range from 25,000, which is still quite a good chunk right there. They could be 100,000, or they could be a percentage of your gross revenue, which, depending on your size of the organization, can be quite a large number. Now, outside of that, let's revisit the question of, is it worth running the risk? Which ultimately I already alluded to, but the quick and short answer would be no, it is not worth running the risk. The potential negatives that may occur far outweigh the potential cost savings of keeping any of those end of life, end of support systems in your environment. There are ways to secure that, and we'll go over that in a bit. However, that is the bottom line. Now let's look again and examine the instance of a potential cybersecurity incident or a potential breach. Depending on the type of incident, depending on the scope of the impacted assets or information systems, and potentially the data involved, if there was any type of manipulation, alteration, exfiltration, or unauthorized access, and an abundant amount of other factors, the organization may be required to pay a very substantial amount in incident response services, especially if they don't have a right size cyber insurance policy. Now, these efforts, these incident response efforts and services could easily tally more than $250,000, again, depending on all those factors. So that is quite pricey, and ultimately it may be cheaper just to have upgraded those systems in retrospect, of course. Now, looking at the cybersecurity incident again, let's dig a little bit deeper and get a little bit more specific, but not overly technical. Let's say that the initial access that was gained by the attacker was attributed to that end of life system or systems, and then that attacker was able to pivot throughout the environment. They were able to access numerous sources and systems in the environment, and then ultimately they placed something such as ransomware on a majority or a subset of those systems. Ransomware is not something that organizations are easily able to recover or bounce back from, more times than not, at least. Because of this, there is often a significant downtime and exposure associated. Every minute, hour, day that an organization and its operations are effectively down due to an incident due to ransomware, they lose money. They attract unnecessary attention from consumers, partners, potential media outlets have to make public statements. And again, depending on the severity and complexity of the incident, the organization may have to remain down and not functioning for up to a subset of weeks. Again, this could total millions and millions of dollars just from that lack of functionality and lack of revenue stream. Again, it depends on the organization, but this is very real and very possible. And then additionally, it's possible that data breaches due to insecure systems, such as directly through an end of life system, may result in some type of lawsuit brought upon the company. Again, yet another vector, of potential loss of money and surely negative exposure. Depends on your contractual agreements with your customers and consumers, but they may have something to the effect of, reasonably securing customers' data to a certain degree, and these end of life systems may just not accomplish that. So we'll take a look in a second about a specific incident that happened, which is known as the largest ransomware campaign to this point, which is the WannaCry ransomware. So as I mentioned earlier, there are boundless instances, of bad actors, sophisticated, low level, abusing the very easy to exploit vulnerabilities that exist with end of life systems. Not just Windows 10 in a few months from now, but previous versions. And again, this ransomware campaign, it's a little bit old at this point. However, the principle, the events surrounding it are very relevant. So back in 2017 and extending a little bit beyond that, we revisit the WannaCry ransomware campaign. This affected over 200,000 systems in over 150 countries. Very widespread. It's crazy to even think that. So it's quite substantial, one of the widest spread campaigns to date. And underneath all the madness that erupted, emergency systems being down due to hospitals being ransomed and patients not being able to be serviced, and money lost from various companies, were outdated Windows systems, Windows XP systems that were still running that had these latent exploitable vulnerabilities, allowing the attackers to exploit those weaknesses. The systems are many times more likely to be compromised if they remain in this state. And that's exactly what happened. The attackers compromised those systems. They targeted them because they were easy to exploit, and then they used another mechanism to spread throughout the network and further ransom the machines. And we can move on from here.
So that all sounds pretty serious. We're going over here the things that you maybe don't want to hear about end of life systems. That's one. It's risky, it's serious. There are real world examples of how these things have been exploited. And from here, we're going to transition over to the second thing that you maybe don't want to hear about end of life management, and that is that you have to start planning earlier than you think. So, Brendan, I'm going to hand this one over to you.
Thank you. If you can just advance the slide, please. All right. So one of the major things that you have to do is auditing your environment, and that takes a significant amount of time. Many organizations that we work with have many systems that are stuck in a closet, stuck under somebody's desk, nobody's aware of, provides a really critical function. So taking the time to audit the environment is really, really important. And then going through and ordering either new equipment or performing that refresh also takes a significant amount of time in order to address. So starting early is really, really critical. This isn't an easy thing of just upgrading, a bunch of machines. There's a lot to take into account. So having that early start really, really helps in order to meet the deadline, which is October this year. Vance, please.
Awesome. And from here, we are going to talk about another thing you probably don't want to hear. This is another spooky one. You may have end of life technologies in your environment that you don't know about. So, Brendan, right back to you to talk about how you can get visibility into this.
Correct. Thank you, Stephanie. So first thing you want to do is complete a full asset inventory, finding all the machines in your environment, knowing what they do, knowing what applications work on them. There's a lot of business critical applications that are critical to an organization. So finding out and categorizing the criticality in terms of how it impacts business operations, and mapping their dependencies. Which systems are dependent on others, which ones are producing your invoicing, receipts, day-to-day operations, and those type of things. And then doing a whole inventory in terms of the end of life warranty expiration for each of these assets. So most of your major vendors have the ability to be able to look up any of your serial numbers or hardware IDs in terms of warranty status, those type of things. So get a really good start in figuring out when are these systems end of life, and knowing when they need to be refreshed in order to make sure that your environment is up to date. And then you want to verify with each of your vendors the support status for a lot of their applications, software, hardware, those type of things. A lot of the sort of newer security protections that Microsoft does introduce, which has been in previous versions of Windows as well, is things like driver signing. So, running old drivers could potentially not work on a Windows 11 machine if the driver certificate, for example, has expired. So being able to collect all of those peripherals and things that connect to those machines, really, really important, and knowing whether those drivers are going to work. Things that we encounter pretty often are things like printers, scanners, those type of devices, especially the ones that have been, sitting for years and years in the middle of the office and just keeps working and working until, we hit a new version of Windows, and all of a sudden driver issues can introduce, problems with printing, formatting, those type of things. And then taking a look at things like your firmware and BIOS versions, including drivers as well. A lot of these newer versions of Windows run, a different type of BIOS, which is known as UEFI. So making sure that your systems have that support and knowing which ones you're going to have to turn over and move over later on is really, really critical. Windows 11 does have some requirements in terms of hardware that needs to be on the device, such as the TPM chip, which helps with encryption and storing certificates and those type of things. You do need to have secure boot enabled on these devices, so getting that visibility and knowing about your environment and which devices will need to be replaced is really critical in order to start down this journey of moving on in terms of the upgrade to Windows 11. And then I'll hand it over to Josh to talk about assessing the risk.
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. So, piggybacking off of what you said surrounding gaining visibility, getting that inventory of assets and how it relates to potential end of life, right after that, it's very crucial to understand if there are any underlying vulnerabilities related to those end of life systems, and ultimately, regarding those vulnerabilities, get the severity, the potential for exploit, and potential other factors associated with those vulnerabilities. So, in order to get that information, in order to really have actionable information, you first need to either acquire a tool or have a service, run a service that is capable of scanning your assets for vulnerabilities. And ultimately and optimally, this would be on some type of a continual basis in order to best identify what vulnerabilities may reside on those systems. At this point, you then gain a clearer picture of the scope of the vulnerabilities and which ones may need to be prioritized due to factors such as ease of exploitability or exploitability having actually happened out in the wild. And additionally, you should attempt to understand which EOL systems are really most critical to you, your environment, your operations, and other. They should really be actioned first, as ultimately they are most important to your operations. It's also essential to understand how an attacker's access to that system or subset of systems could impact other systems or services that you run as well. How can one instance of compromise turn into just from one instance to two to 20 or whatever have you? And that's kind of how we jump into the next prompt, which is evaluating your safeguards. You really want to understand, if we advance a slide, how your safeguards are today and whether you have competent controls in place now to mitigate the vulnerabilities of which you now know exist, or if there are gaps or areas of improvement that you can further protect that today are unprotected. It's worthwhile investigating if there are any compensating controls you can put in place now or future proofing to lessen the likelihood of exploitation or lessen the likelihood of propagation after exploitation. So ensuring that one instance of compromise doesn't turn into two or 20 or whatever have you, and eventually get to systems that are more critical or your production environment. Alrighty, I'm good on this section.
Awesome. Thanks, Josh. And for anyone who wants to learn more about the process of auditing your environment, we have a strategic discovery checklist you can download using the QR code on this screen or the link at the bottom there. We go into a lot more detail in this guide and cover some essential considerations about how you can keep on top of your environment in this way. We'll also link this guide at the end on the slides, and we will email this link to everybody on the session today. So if you don't have time to scan this code, don't worry, we will send this to you. So let's move on to our second section of the day, where we will be talking specifically about addressing Windows 10. As I mentioned before, this specific end of life date is getting a lot of buzz right now. It's coming up very soon. I'm sure it's very top of mind for anybody in the IT space. So first, we're going to talk about how to prepare, and then we will talk about some migration paths. So Brendan, this really is your expertise here. Can you walk us through this process?
Sure. Thank you, Susan. So we've talked about doing your full thorough audit of your environment. You're going to need to start categorizing devices that are going to meet the Windows 11 upgrade requirements for things like TPM 2.0, secure boot, making sure they have enough processor and RAM availability. You're going to have a couple of buckets in terms of machines that are going to be end of life that either need to be replaced, or you have to have some kind of mitigating factor to make sure that these machines are protected until we can cycle them out. And then you're going to have machines that are going to need to be able to have to be upgraded to Windows 11 because they just don't meet any of the requirements. And then you're going to have machines that can be upgraded. So part of this, in terms of that whole journey, this is the planning piece and the testing phase where the most amount of time is really being spent. So looking at your application compatibility, working with your vendors to make sure that all your applications are compatible with Windows 11. Now, for the most part, most modern applications are backwards compatible with Windows 10 and forwards compatible with Windows 11. However, we encounter a lot of organizations that have critical pieces of software that have been running for years and years and have not been updated. So working with those vendors is really, really important. You also want to draw up an application risk register to find out, what are the applications that are really critical to your business operations, which are the ones that you could do without in case there are some compatibility issues, and then be able to start working and addressing those. So your business critical ones are the ones that you really need to hit first and make sure that those are completely compatible with Windows 11. Those are the ones that's basically, if they stop working, your business stops functioning. You can leverage, Microsoft does have a program called the Microsoft Aperture Compatibility Program, where they can work with organizations in order to try assist them with being able to help make sure that their applications are working. This obviously doesn't cover every single application that's out there, but they will work with most organizations to try at least get the applications functioning in some kind of way. There are some caveats around that program, which we can go into a little bit later, but that's a really good resource to help with application compatibility. And then the other thing you need to look at is basically your infrastructure. Deploying your Windows 11 upgrades, there's a couple of routes you can take. So one of them is basically doing upgrades either via some kind of device management or just an in-place upgrade, via the Windows Update service. Some of that, is going to require network bandwidth in order to download the Windows 11 binaries and do those upgrades. Look at how you're managing your devices. So you're going to have some devices that are under management of some kind of device management, some that are not. How do you tie those in together, and what is the upgrade strategy in terms of each of those types of devices? If you're running Intune or SCCM, or you have an MSP that already has your devices under management, those are a lot easier to perform these upgrades and making sure that we're ready in terms of all the requirements in order to get these upgrades done. The other thing that you probably want to look at, there are a lot of organizations that use some kind of desktop virtualization, making sure that the infrastructure is ready for that. So with Windows 11 requiring TPM, if you have a virtualized environment, either running Citrix or Hyper-V, for example, where you're doing remote desktop virtualization, you need to make sure that you can use either Secure Boot, Secure Boot plus a virtual TPM in order to make sure that these Windows 11 machines still work. So making sure that your infrastructure supports it and the hardware in terms of your servers, for example, support virtual TPMs. That rings true for most major vendors. They do have support for it on their latest versions of their hypervisors. So making sure that you are on at least some of the later upgrades in terms of that support around virtual TPM and Secure Boot will definitely help give you a long way to go in terms of performing that upgrade. Next, we're going to talk about the pilot program and how to start addressing that. So once you've done your audit, you've assessed your applications, you know which ones are compatible, which ones are not compatible, and you've got your list of machines that need to be upgraded and which ones are going to be replaced and cycled, you're going to need to start a pilot program. So one of the things that we typically advise customers is being able to work with a wide variety of users in order to make sure that they're comfortable. There are going to be some changes that they're not used to. For example, Windows 11 has the start button in the middle of the screen. Windows 10 had it on the left-hand side. There are ways to change that, but the default functionality is going to look a little bit different for your user base, although for the most part it is fairly similar to Windows 10. You do want to make sure that you're not just testing IT people. So IT people tend to have a thing of just figuring things out on their own, whereas your end user base will typically not be able to work or need some assistance. So having that diverse group of users being able to run through your pilot program and testing their workflows, testing the things that they do on a day-to-day basis, making sure their applications work, making sure that things like printing work and device scanning, emailing, those type of things, uploading documents, making sure all those type of things are working. You also want to include a large variety of different hardware configurations. So most organizations don't have a set specific fleet of machines that they roll out to their users. So making sure that each of the sort of hardware profiles that you do have within your organization is really critical to making sure that you can test each of those, especially when it comes to things like drivers and just the peripherals that may connect to some of these machines. After that, we want to be able to gather the user feedback, see what's working and what's not working. Some users are going to have trouble doing certain actions, making sure that you have some steps to resolve that. So you want to collect all that information. Look, is there a compatibility issue? Is there an application issue that's causing them? Is it something to do with the upgrade? What does that user experience look like? So from when that user gets their new machine, and they've got Windows 11 on, what is that user experience going to look like for them? What is that feedback that you're going to get in terms of, hey, when I started, I wasn't able to do X, or I wasn't able to do Y. Getting that feedback, so when you start rolling it out to the large user base, you have a lot of those things taken care of before it gets to the wider user population. And then basically refining that process, going back and rectifying any of the things that were found during the pilot program, especially around the hardware and software side and the user touch points of where they were struggling or the things they weren't able to find, especially if some of the menus and those type of things have changed. They may have some trouble finding things, so having those type of things refined within your larger deployment process will go a long way in terms of making this a really successful deployment. One of the things that we do recommend is having some training materials ready for users when they get their new machines, having a quick start guide in order to be able to navigate quickly how to find common things that they're used to using, how do they access their applications, where are they located, those type of things. And then if you have a help desk in your organization, be able to prep them for any of the common things that you found during the pilot program of issues that they may encounter. You may have an application that popped up an unfamiliar window that a user wasn't used to. So having your help desk people trained up on those type of issues that you encounter and how to solve them, and having that knowledge base built up before you do that full rollout will really go a long way in making sure that this is a really successful deployment. It's really good to have a communication campaign early on for your user base, notifying them that Windows 11 is coming, getting them excited about it, explaining what the benefits are, knowing when they're going to be able to upgrade when those upgrades are happening. Are they getting a new machine? Are they not? Are we doing an in-place upgrade? What does that timeline look like? Keeping them basically really informed and making sure that this is really smooth for the user base. Any project is really based on the user experience. So if the users don't have a really good experience during the rollout, the project is going to be seen as a failure, even though it might have been technically successful. So making sure that the user experience is really good is really critical to these types of upgrades. And then talking about the migration paths that you have. So during the audit process, you're going to find machines that you're not able to upgrade and things that you aren't. So you've either got to put some mitigating support in place for the ones that you're not able to upgrade, or you need to be able to upgrade some of these machines. So knowing what our minimum requirements are, if you have machines that are meeting those minimum requirements, we know we can do a direct Windows upgrade. If you need to refresh those machines, we'll know that we need to do that. And then figuring out how to tackle each of these. So do you have managed, unmanaged devices? Each of those migration paths are going to look a little bit different. So if you're using Windows System Update Manager, for example, you would have to make sure that you've got the update releases primed and ready for those machines that we're going to be deploying. If you're using Intune or some remote management software, knowing what that migration path looks like, being able to push those upgrades to the machines that require them. If you have unmanaged devices, for the large majority of these are either going to be in-place upgrades, either via a CD or allowing the user to do a direct upgrade, which we don't recommend, in order to get that machine upgraded. The other thing that you could potentially use is Azure Virtual Desktop to mitigate any applications that may or may not work. Luckily, Microsoft does have extended update support for Windows 10 if you're using Azure Virtual Desktop. So that's an option if you have applications that are not compatible with Windows 11. You could run them in Azure Virtual Desktop. And then for the customers that have certain Microsoft licensing SKUs, do have access to a Windows 365 Cloud PC. This is kind of very similar to the Azure Virtual Desktop environment, but it's a persistent desktop that's available to you, where you could run some of your applications that may or may not work on Windows 10 or 11, to be able to, at least provide them a working environment to run those applications. Yeah, thank you, Stephanie.
Thanks, Brendan. I'm sure a lot of people on this session are thinking, I'm not sure I'm going to make it in time. So we got you covered. We're going to talk about contingency planning when you're not sure you can migrate off any end-of-life technology in time. So Josh, I'm going to start with you on this slide on the left side here. What do organizations need to think about when it comes to making the decision to either replace or secure a technology that's gone end of life?
Or if the organization is kind of debating or unsure how to best analyze whether they should replace systems or upgrade them or secure the end-of-life systems and keep them, there are a few key things, excuse me, to assist in the decision-making process. And ultimately, two on the security side that are massive are, is the endpoint or endpoints, are they public facing or critical in nature? So going back to one of the earlier exercises, you would have already examined if this system or systems, if they are critical in nature to your organization. But additionally, it's also good to understand whether they are public facing or if they're just end user ordinary machines, right? Big difference between the two there. And then additionally, are these systems in scope of any compliance efforts? If the answer is yes to that, then the organization will more than likely want to prioritize this as to not have any penalty faced by the organization during those compliance efforts or any knocks toward the compliance efforts.
The other thing that you need to use as a factor in determining whether to replace or secure is how easy is it to migrate their system. We have encountered organizations where they have a business critical application and it's almost near impossible to replace that across the entire fleet, especially when it comes to application compatibility issues. So one of those deciding factors is how easy is it to migrate that system off, and will we be able to maintain that system in the long run or not? So that is a really large factor in deciding whether you're going to replace that or not. The same thing goes in terms of how long are you willing to run these unsupported systems? Is that a short-term period thing where a vendor is going to be releasing an update to this application and has compatibility, or even if you're running a machine that you're sweating that asset for a couple of months where you have your next budget cycle and are going to be able to upgrade, do you put in those mitigating factors to try secure those machines as much as you can?
Awesome. So, ideally, your organization has first examined your specific situation using the criteria that Josh and Brendan have just shared with us. But if you decide that, at least right now, you need to keep the end of life system in your environment, your option here is that you need to work on securing your environment. Josh, what steps should organizations take in this case?
Sure. So if the organization has chosen to accept the risk due to budgetary constraints or other reasons, there are definitely still things that you may be able to do to lessen the likelihood of exploitation, breach, and ultimately bolster the security of those systems. And a good starting place is partially to create a vulnerability management program if one does not exist, or examine the existing one and ensure that you do have the ability to scan the systems, identify these vulnerabilities, a systematic approach to prioritization and then treatment or actioning of those vulnerabilities, right? Not just the end of life systems, of course, try to make it a program that's holistic in nature, but with a specific lens on those end of life systems or end of support systems. And then again, should the organization ever choose to accept a risk such as this, we should certainly document it, and it should be revisited on some type of cadence to either, again, accept said risk for the same justification or other, or to hopefully examine it for any actions that we can do to best mitigate. And then moving forward, having a mature EDR agent or next gen antivirus solution, something of that nature, is obviously very important to best ensure your physical hardware and the data on those machines are not accessed or not able to be accessed by any unauthorized users through any unauthorized fashion. This is again able to best protect and detect these potential threats before or during when they happen, and potentially even prevent them outright. Therefore, it doesn't take place. You know about it, and then you can use your actionable intelligence that you've gained to potentially then motion toward an upgrade or find out where the gap was that almost led to exploitation. Yeah, so segmentation is massive here. If we're going to have any end of life systems, again, depending on the amount, there may be a better case for it. But if we're going to have any end of life systems in our environment at all, it's definitely going to be a good approach to attempt to segment these hosts from the rest of the network. So that in the case of a compromise, kind of like we talked about earlier, it's going to be much more difficult for lateral movement, excuse me, to take place should an attacker gain initial access through one of these end of life systems. It's a pretty painless process to do, and it is definitely worthwhile pursuing. Restricting access control is obviously a big component to any successful security program, and nothing changes here. Restricting access to these hosts only those necessary for operations or for their job responsibility is a great idea, and enforcing this strict authentication mechanism would be desirable as well. And we could enforce this strict authentication mechanism through some type of conditional access. We could lessen the likelihood of potential login attempts, even through something such as geofencing. And these are all great ideas to just restrict access and ensure that no unauthorized access takes place. Yep. And then obviously, right on the back end of that, where possible, we should ensure that we're using modern authentication mechanisms and not any legacy authentication mechanisms, especially on these end of life systems, but for all systems, of course. And this can be done through, Microsoft proprietary technologies, or this can be done through third-party authentication applications like a Duo, or through an on-device agent or certificate like an RSA Secure ID. So there are a lot of methods in which this can take place. So again, revisiting this because this is the topic of everything. Ultimately, the risk should not remain permanently, right? We should attempt to develop some type of replacement target, be it the next budget cycle or whatever we can next commit to. We just want to make sure that we do not forget about it and allow it to persist in the environment for good.
Um, And of course, as we've been discussing today, and as our ghost friends cartwheeling across the screen have been reminding us, there are real risks involved here. So it's important to make sure you're managing any risks you decide to accept the best you can. And at Data Prize, this is something we certainly specialize in. Josh, do you want to talk about the security side of things?
Sure, sure. I mean, as you can probably tell, I'm a little bit excited and passionate about this from me raising my pitch here and there. But really, DataPrize is capable of assisting with all of what Brendan and I have mentioned to this point, whether it is upgrading the systems or whether it is more on the security side of securing said systems and coming up with a strategy to best secure and protect your end of life systems if you plan on keeping end of life systems in the environment. And we're able to do this through a variety of ways, but as we already spoke about, vulnerability management, right? DataPrize does offer a vulnerability management component in which we can assist organizations in both recognizing, prioritizing, and treating these potential risks on vulnerable EOL systems, but also other systems. We want a holistic approach. And then additionally, the SIM and the EDR. This is not 24 by 7 system monitor. This is 24 by 7 security expert monitor. These are real people, real security experts at Data Price SOC looking at these systems. The agent on the device, the EDR, is best to detect and prevent, and ultimately the organization should bring these logs into a SIM with all the other data sources that are applicable to best correlate with the other logs and provide additional insights for these security analysts to really dig in and understand what's going on. And then on the security advisory side, the security advisory team is equipped with all the knowledge necessary to assist in game planning the overall large strategy at play here to best protect those end of life systems and ultimately guide that risk management approach.
Awesome. And Brendan, do you want to talk about the technical mitigation side of things?
Sure. Um, so a couple of things that you can do is enabling conditional access and multi-factor authentication to try prevent some of these attacks from happening. That goes a long way. Segmenting these machines off, like Josh had mentioned previously, and keeping them cordoned off from the rest of the general network is a really good idea, and we can take, definitely help with that. And then maybe taking a look at cloud as your next step in terms of either running as VDI and providing that sort of legacy access for applications either via Windows Cloud PC or Azure Virtual Desktop, and able to facilitate that because they do take advantage of the extended update support that Microsoft has in place.
Awesome. So that brings us to the end of our session today. So I will wrap us up with some quick takeaways. First, get started early and often. It can take longer than you think, and end of life technology may creep into your environment if you're not auditing things regularly. Second, there are multiple migration paths available, especially when it comes to Windows 10 end of life, as Brennan was talking to us about. So make sure you are thinking about your environment and the unique challenges that you're facing to choose the most effective migration path for your organization. And thirdly, our spooky friend is back. Risk is real and can be expensive. Doing nothing doesn't mean nothing is happening. What's happening is that your risk is growing. And we just talked a minute ago about how DataPrice can help you with contingency planning if you're not ready to move off Windows 10, but we can also help you before it gets to that point. We can help you move to Windows 11 with support from the planning and procurement stages through implementation and migration. And of course, on the security side as well, we can help you make a plan, manage those vulnerabilities, and implement next gen security solutions to keep your environment protected. So I will end by saying thank you to Brendan and Josh both, and thank you to our audience on the line as well for joining us today. We are going to get to our Q&A time here, but a quick reminder that when you leave the session at any time now, if you answer 3 short questions, you will be entered to win $50 in our raffle. And we will take these last few minutes here for Q&A. Before I do that, though, we have a link and a QR code here, again, to that strategic discovery checklist. If you're looking for more resources to help support your end-of-life management strategy, you can get all three of these guides pictured here on this page. If you go to this link, that will help you every step of the way. We again also are going to send this link in our follow-up email for the session, so you can wait for it there too, either way. So thank you to everyone in the audience today, and to those of you that submitted questions. We do have time here for Q&A, so I'm going to pull up the question box here. Here's our first one for you guys. Can you address the extended support option Microsoft is giving? How will it work once purchased? Is it sufficient to mitigate until Q1 when we have time for a hardware refresh with Windows 11?
I'll take that. So yes, Microsoft does offer extended support updates that you can purchase through the Microsoft Volume Purchase Program. I believe they start at $61 per device for a year. However, that cost doubles each consecutive year, and that is only available for a maximum of 3 years. That will still give you security updates to those devices. It won't include any kind of new features, any design change requests, any of those type of things, but they will provide security updates for up to the next 3 years if you decide to purchase the extended security updates.
Awesome. We have a ton of very similar questions to this about those extended security updates. So give me 1 second here. Let me pop through. Here's another one. How can one verify if third-party software apps will be compatible on Windows 11?
So testing is a really good way to do it, but you can also take advantage of the Microsoft App Assure program. That's part of the fast track assistance that Microsoft has. It's a program they started in 2018 to basically try and show application compatibility on Microsoft technology. They try to provide as much support as they can to help assist with compatibility issues on things like Windows 10 and 11, Microsoft 365, Azure Virtual Desktop, those type of things. So you can definitely leverage them as well, but testing is a really good way, and then obviously leveraging vendor support as well. If you have custom managed code, either working with the developer or with the Microsoft App Assure program can definitely help with some of those potential compatibility issues.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And another one here. How should organizations with a limited budget approach upgrading unsupported systems?
So from a limited budget perspective, I would look at the older systems first, the ones that can't run Windows 11 at all. So those are the ones that I would either see if we can cycle them out with some lower cost units. Otherwise, maybe looking at something, especially if you are eligible, into some of the Microsoft licensing additions that you get, depending on your licensing that you have with, for example, M365. Microsoft does offer some things like Windows 365 Cloud PC, which can help with that. Short of that, you could look at some refurbished hardware from your major vendors like Dell and HP. They do have a refurbished program that will allow you to get some lower cost hardware that is compatible with Windows 11. That can help you, tide you over until budget is available.
Awesome. Another one here. Are there simple mistakes we should try to avoid when upgrading supported systems to Windows 11?
I think the biggest thing is just making assumptions in terms of what is or isn't working. Testing, making sure that your group policies and those type of things are going to work. Obviously, every organization is different, and those type of GPOs and those type of things will have different effects on different organizations depending on what is set. I think the critical thing is really around application compatibility and doing that pilot program. We do see a lot of organizations that go through this where we've been asked to assist, where they've kind of forgoed the whole pilot program and getting that testing done with the general user base. The other thing that I mentioned previously was only doing testing with IT people. IT people tend to just fix things. and then move on with their day. Users will get stuck on a lot of things, and users are typically the people that will report issues. So getting that feedback is really, really critical. An IT person encounters an issue, they'll go and fix it and move on with their day. You start your general user rollout, all of a sudden everybody's encountering these same issues that the IT person just fixed on their own. Nobody knows what to do. You can definitely prevent that by making sure that your pilot program is really across the general user base before rolling it out to the general population. Those are some of the common things that we find that are fairly easily fixable just on a process perspective.
Awesome. I loved what you said earlier about how, the success of the migration is determined by how well it's received by users, even if the
User
technology
experience.
side goes well, if users are not having a great time, it's going to seem like it did not go well. So that's definitely, I think that's such a key there to make sure that you keep those users in mind. All right, so we've gotten through our questions here. If you still have questions that we haven't answered, go ahead, throw them in the chat. We have a few minutes, but if not, feel free to reach out to us and we'll get those questions answered. I have our email down at the bottom of the slide here right now. You can reach out to, but I will close this out here with a thank you to our experts, Josh and Brendan. Thank you so much for being here with us today, for sharing your knowledge with us. One last thank you to our audience for joining us. A reminder that if you answer our quick three short questions survey at the end, that we will enter you in that raffle. We hope that everybody on the line learned something new from today's event, and we hope to see you on the next one.
Thank you everybody for joining.